Mayor Dana Ralph, and I'm joined today by Chief Ralph Padilla. And this is the fourth video in our series talking about some of the changes that came through the 2021 legislative session and how they're impacting policing here in Kent and across the state. Thanks for joining me today, Chief.
My pleasure. Glad to be here. We
have a couple of topics to go over today. We'll start with certification and decertification of police officers, duty to intervene, which is something that Kent has already done a fair amount of work on. And then we are going to close with data collection and what that means in the realm of policing and what it means to our community. Let's start with Senate Bill 5051. This is around criteria for the decertification of a police officer. So can you maybe start out and sort of tell us what certification means and what then decertification looks like in context with this new legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Washington State, we have a peace officer certification standard, and that standard is administered through the Criminal Justice Training Commission, which is a Washington division, right? It's what we call the basic academy. It also houses corrections training, advanced training, and other criminal justice related training. And so they are the hub, and the model that we use in Washington State is that we have a centralized training so that what you see in Kent is very similar to what you see in Yakima and what you see in Vancouver. It's important for that consistency for the community, which is great. So up to now, prior to the enactment of Senate Bill 5051, there were standards for decertification, things where of misconduct, committing a crime, some dishonesty standards for certain cases could result in the Criminal Justice Training Commission decertifying you, which means you cannot be a police officer in the state. And so that was in existence now. What they have done in the subsequent and this legislation that's enacted in July is that they've identified and gone more in depth into what is certified, what they can be decertified for. There's additional provisions. Additionally, they gave the authority of the Criminal Justice Training Commission to conduct their own investigations. Up to now, it's been on the law enforcement agency or the county or the AG's office to conduct investigations. Now they have the authority under law to conduct an investigation if for some reason they want to do something in additional to what we've already done. The law also gives the Criminal Justice Training Commission, and I'll call it CJTC for short, it gives them the authority to suspend certification, which is a very interesting concept because what that means is while the process is being worked out and for however long that will take, CJTC can say, well, until we figure this out, your license or your certification is suspended, which poses a really interesting question for me as to now what do I do with this police officer? But we will work through that. There isn't a time limit on that administered by the law. It expands requirements for background checks, pre-hire background checks, and it requires things that we are fully in compliance with here in Kent. So most of this isn't a major impact, I should say, on Kent. It requires law enforcement and counties to complete IAs, internal investigations, even if the employee resigns. So prior to this law, if I had an officer that I believed had serious misconduct, I would start an internal affairs investigation, an IA. And sometimes the officer, realizing that they're in serious trouble, that the consequences are going to be dire, would often resign. And so they would resign, and we would not complete the investigation because at that point, resources weren't necessary to do that. The law requires that we will go all the way through with the IA, and we will submit the reports to the CJTC.
So I'm going to jump in really quick there. Yeah. So in that scenario where we've had it happen where the officer realizes the misconduct is such that they should not be working for the City of Kent and the City of Kent does not want them working here, does this second layer, this new piece, then could that officer have left the City of Kent and gone to another police department, and does this address that issue?
I think that's what the intent of the law is, right? And so they want a completed record for future employment considerations. So I think that is part of it. It'll be interesting to see how that works, because one of the things that goes away when they resign is my authority to compel them to give us a statement as to what happened, right? So if we have an allegation where the officer is the only person who knows really what happened and that person resigns, I'm not sure how we complete that. But again, these are things I'm sure as we get into it, we'll work through it and we'll figure some of them out.
Sounds like very positive intent, and again, like some of the things we've talked about in previous videos, there's going to be a process in figuring out how to apply them sort of in the real world scenarios.
Correct. So the question, I guess, is, what's going to be the impact? And for Mr. and Mrs. Kent, there really won't be any noticeable impact. This is a internal safeguard measure, if you will, by the state to ensure that departments, that chiefs of police and sheriffs are doing the right thing by addressing problem police officers. And it's something that we support. Again, not a huge deviation from what we do, but there are some noticeable things that will be interesting should these come to head. One is officers are represented by their unions, and so they are by state law given binding arbitration rights, which means there is a process, they have due process. We've talked about before, it is a significant process to fire a police officer. And so sometimes, going back to the resignation thing, sometimes a resignation was in the best interest of the community, and I'll just be honest about that. This kind of takes away the ability to do that. The other thing is it doesn't address the ruling by an arbiter. So let's say we decide we're going to terminate a police officer for whatever misconduct. We go through the process, we take it all the way to a binding arbitration hearing, and let's say the arbiter, who does not work for the city of Kent, says, we disagree, Mayor and Chief, we don't think you should have fired this officer. The arbiter currently, on current law, can reinstate an officer and insist that we backfill all their time loss and pay and all of that. What's not addressed in the law is, so what happens then if the CJTC decides that they're going to decertify this officer who's been put back to work by an arbiter? So now I have potentially a decertified police officer who has been put back to work by an arbiter. So it's some of these questions, some of these nuances. I believe if they become an issue, I have faith we'll have an opportunity to address that with the legislature.
The thing it doesn't change is our commitment here in Kent to only have the highest quality officers. And if we do see a problem, there is a solid commitment on your part and my part to address them. And then the system works through how the system works through. But in the end, it's about making the right decision for the residents of Kent.
Absolutely.
So next on our list to talk about is Senate Bill 5066, which is the duty to intervene. Can you tell us how this impacts Kent, how it will impact the operations for Kent PD? And I said this a little bit earlier about some of the things that we've already done in this realm.
Right. The good news, as you know, Mayor, is we've anticipated this law. We recognize it as something we needed in our policies on our own through working with our community the last year and a half now almost, and so we established some time ago a duty to intervene policy. So it's already in place. The officers are already practicing it. The nuances from what the law requires and what we currently do are pretty minor. We are grappling with a term that is in the law that isn't clearly defined. So our legal advisors have some work to do, and the law creates a wrongdoing standard. So an officer in uniform is required to report and intervene if necessary whenever he sees another officer doing wrongdoing. So that needs to get clarified. We have a team of attorneys actually, because all of the city advisors are working on this right now in the South King County area, and I'm sure across the state. So we'll get that hammered out. We'll know what that means. It does require that we report these incidents within 10 days usually, and there are penalties, potentially decertification for an officer who does not comply with the duty to intervene. And then the law requires that all departments have a policy by June 2022, which is We just have to modify some of our language, and we're already there.
Good. Yeah, so the good news is we have that policy, just it's the details, like you said, defining terms that may not have existed in the previous policy or in the vernacular of policing in the state of Washington. So I think this is absolutely something that everyone gets behind, right? It's that same thing, see something, say something. It applies to police officers, it applies to our community, it applies out in the rest of the world. So the last one that we have is to talk a little bit about data collection, and this is House Bill 5259, and it covers law enforcement data collection. Can you walk us through this bill, some of the impacts and what we're doing to get ready for it?
So this is another good bill, and one that's going to be fairly easy for Kent Police to adjust to for a bunch of factors. So the law requires a universal reporting process for use of force incidents and other related police activity as defined in the law, and so that's getting worked out currently. It establishes a university to be the oversight and collecting the data and providing both a public portal for access to data and a law enforcement access, right? So we'll be able to get in there, not only look at our data, but look at what the comparable cities look at other jurisdictions, and kind of get a grasp for where we fall in terms of the state in terms of use of force. I think this is a great thing. You and I have talked a lot publicly to the community about we strongly support data collection, and this gives us an opportunity to do it in a uniform way versus us standing up and being, the first to go out and collect data, which is always going to look disproportionate when you're the first. So it's going to be a statewide requirement. We'll all be providing the same data in the same format, and so this is a really good thing in terms of transparency, building trust and accountability to the community. There are some other benefits to this. Right now, the law was drafted, and a firm called Police Strategies was a big part of helping draft this legislation. Well, we just so happened to do an RFP for our own police data collection project here in Kent. As you know, Mayor, you directed that happen, and the City Council also authorized that. We're in the middle of that project right now, and what I'm very thankful for is that we happen to do a good job of picking the firm that set the template for how the state's going to do it. So I imagine we will have some technical hurdles to overcome because we don't have systems yet, but we will get those. We are going to be well positioned to be in compliance and submitting our data.
The thing that I appreciate about this legislation so much is the uniformity. We've talked a lot about if you have 10 different departments that are collecting the same piece of information, but they're doing it in different ways, they're reporting it different ways. It's the comparing apples to oranges, and being able to set community standard needs to be with, kind of across the board. What does this look like? Is Kent in line with that community standard across the state, or are we out of line? And until we have that really good data, it's hard to make those judgments. And really excited about the police strategies piece of this, because they are the experts in this field. And while I'm going to say it, right, we've got some technology challenges, but it's nothing that we can't overcome. And I'm also very excited about their guidance on and community outreach around what we should be collecting. So there's the House bill that is very specific, and then there's going to be other pieces of data that we'll be able to collect using their expertise to help the community understand policing here in Kent, what it looks like, and like you said, the ultimate goal is to build trust and transparency. Yeah. So I think that brings us to the end of our discussion today. I want to thank everyone for hanging in there with us through this series of videos. Lots of important and significant changes coming to policing here in Kent as a result of this 2021 legislative session. Want to ensure our residents that we are committed to making the changes the legislature has requested and making sure that we're implementing things here in Kent in a way that makes sense in keeping our community safe. Chief, anything you'd like to add in closing?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to get the message out. As always, we're open to any feedback and or follow-up questions. I appreciate your leadership on this, and we're going to do a good job taking care of the community.
Thank you.